So now that we know some things about genes and alleles, we're going to talk about why Gregor Mendel was so lucky in his selection of a few particular genes. So again, here, this is my chromosome 17 or whatever it happens to be, and these are homologous chromosomes because I got this one from my mom, I got this one from my dad. And if we look in and we look at a particular gene, we'll see I have two versions of a particular allele. I have a gene from my mom that says I'm good at fishing, and I have a gene from my dad that says I'm bad at fishing. In this case, being bad at fishing is the dominant allele. By the way, this is just an example. There is no gene for fishing, no one gene for fishing. So, but for this contrived example, being bad at fishing is dominant. So I have an allele that says I'm bad at fishing, so I am bad at fishing. It doesn't matter that I have this allele over here because this particular allele is dominant. Okay, now let's talk about how this sort of scenario came to be where my parents had me. So we do that using a Punnett square, and here are my parents' genotypes for fishing. So my mom has two recessive alleles. These are represented as lowercase letters. So when my grandparents had my mom, they gave her two little g's for being good at fishing. And those are the genes that she has available to her to pass down to me. When my paternal grandparents had my dad, one of them good at fishing allele, a little g, and one of them was bad at fishing. And so my dad is big G, little g. Being bad at fishing is dominant. So in this case, is my dad good at fishing or is my dad bad at fishing? Well, he's bad at fishing because he has this dominant bad at fishing allele. Or the alleles that my dad has available to him to pass on to me are a good at fishing gene and a bad at fishing gene. So let's see how that actually works using this thing called a Punnett square. When you're building a Punnett square, you put one set of parents' possible gametes, you put the alleles that they have available to pass on to the next generation, and we'll put dad on top here. We put them at the top here. And so there are the letters for my dad's gametes that he can pass on to me. You take the other parents' alleles that they have available to pass on, and you put them on the side. So my mom, two good at fishing alleles. We put my mom's alleles for the gene of whether or not you're good at fishing on the side of the Punnett square here. Okay, we have my dad's alleles here, we have my mom's alleles here, and then we see what they can possibly pass down. So this is all of the types of offspring my parents can have looking at this one particular gene. So you take the alleles that you put on top and you bring them into the top box here, and you also bring them down to the second row here. So we have all my dad's alleles plugged in where they need to go. Now we take my mom's alleles and we do something similar. We put them everywhere where they can go. So we put them in the first column and we put them in the second column. This is a picture of every possible offspring that my parents could have had with their particular alleles. This is all of them. For this one particular gene, this is all the possible combinations. This is called a Punnett square. You're going to be expected to do these, so if this is super uncomfortable for you, please come see me in office hours or shoot me an email. But there it is. All possible combinations right there. So which phenotypes do we see here, and which genotypes do we see here? Remember, phenotypes are observable characteristics. So if you went down to the lake and you watched this person fishing, what would it look like? Again, dumb example, but if you were trying to see what their characteristics of this person were, it would be that they're bad at fishing, because bad at fishing is dominant. As soon as you have a capital G, you're bad at fishing. So we see good at fishing and we see bad at fishing. Okay, this person is good at fishing, this person is bad at fishing. What genotypes do we see? What are the actual literal characters that we see here? Well, we see a big G and a little g. We see the same big G and little g here, and we also see a little g and a little g. This big G, little g is what is referred to as heterozygous. Hetero means different. Two different alleles. Big G, little g, this is referred to as heterozygous. We also see little g, little g. This is homozygous recessive. Homozygous, homo meaning the same, you have two copies of the same allele, both of which are recessive. So we see homozygous recessive. Let's think about what phenotypic ratios we see here. This is just like an extra layer. It's not any more complicated, but I see a 1-to-1 ratio or a 2-to-2 ratio of heterozygous to homozygous recessive. What genotypic ratio do we see here? A 1-to-1 ratio of heterozygous and homozygous recessive. Half of my parents' kids are going to be good at fishing because they're homozygous recessive. Half of my parents' kids are going to be bad at fishing because they're heterozygous. Okay, let's look at another example of this. Brown eyes are dominant in this case, so they're represented by a capital B, which means that blue eyes are recessive, and so they're represented by a lowercase b. Let's go ahead and run the Punnett square. We're going to bring this b down, and we're going to bring these b's over. And we can see here that we have a slightly different phenotypic and genotypic ratio than we had from our last example. Our phenotypic ratio is going to be 3 brown-eyed people to 1 blue-eyed person. Okay, 3 brown-eyed people to 1 blue-eyed person. And what kind of genotypic ratio do we see here? We have 1 homozygous dominant, which we haven't talked about yet. Homozygous means you have 2 copies of the same homo allele. And they're dominant, so capital B, homozygous dominant. We have 2 heterozygous individuals here, big B, little b, hetero, different, zygous, allele, and we have 1 homozygous recessive. So these people, again, they're big B, little b, so they have a blue eye allele, but they're still having brown eyes because brown eyes is dominant. And you can think of it like this. If you took a sheet of paper and you colored in blue, but then you took a brown crayon and you colored in on top of that, in essence, that's what's going on here. Okay? Because that brown pigment is darker, it's the only one that shows up, which is why brown eyes are dominant. We also have this notion of incomplete dominance. So in incomplete dominance, this is just an example, but let's say we have a red flower and we cross it with a white flower. We know for sure the alleles of this red flower because it's red, and as we'll see shortly, if it was anything else, it wouldn't be red. And we know for sure the genotype of this white flower because it's white. And when we cross these two, we get a combination of the 2 colors. We get this pink color here. So this is called incomplete dominance, in that you just wind up with a mixture of the 2 traits involved. In incomplete dominance, you wind up with a mixture of the 2 traits. And in incomplete dominance, you can look at the phenotype and immediately determine the genotype. Because if you look at this one, it's red. You know it's capital R, capital R. You look at this one, it's white. You know it's lowercase r, lowercase r. You look at these pink ones in the middle, you know they're heterozygous because they're pink. If they were white, they wouldn't be heterozygous, right? They'd be homozygous recessive. The last example is of blood types in humans, and this is an example of codominance. So if a person has a AA genotype, they wind up with type A blood. If a person has an AO genotype, they still wind up with type A blood. But the interesting part is if a person has an AB genotype, they wind up with type AB blood. Okay? And an AB blood both A and B are expressed equally. So because of codominance, if you are an AB blood type person, all of your blood cells are both type A and type B simultaneously. So in codominance, it's not that there's a mixture of the two traits coming together, it's that both traits are expressed simultaneously.